Hello, everyone. Strap in for an incredible story that's going to blow you away. Make sure you watch until the end. And if you find yourself moved by it, why not subscribe to the channel, right? Okay, let's get started. The old house was sturdy despite its age. I flipped the light switch, illuminating the narrow staircase that descended steeply into the basement. The homeowner, an elderly man, led the way as I followed closely behind. As we reached the bottom, the space brightened, and we found ourselves standing on a granite floor, a small window above letting in a patch of daylight. The cool, dry air enveloped me, and I even felt a slight breeze, a testament to the house's ancient ventilation system. "Feel that draft?" the old man asked, as if reading my thoughts. "Yeah, a bit," I replied, turning to face him. "It's a good basement, spacious and dry. I've made up my mind. I'm buying the house. Let's head back upstairs and sign the papers. The notary is waiting." "No problem. He can wait a little longer," I said with a smile. We made our way back up to the hall, where the notary was waiting patiently. The old man signed the deed of gift. I handed over the agreed-upon sum, and the notary confirmed receipt of the money. Just like that, I became the owner of a historic two-story house in the city's old district. Real estate prices in this area were sky-high, so snagging this place for a reasonable price was a stroke of luck. I had always been drawn to the charm of historic architecture and often found myself wandering the narrow alleys of this neighborhood. That's how I met the old man. We struck up a conversation on one of the many benches lining the streets, and for some reason I felt compelled to share my troubles with him. He listened attentively before inviting me over for a cup of coffee. That's when I first laid eyes on this house and fell in love with it. As if reading my mind, the old man told me his children had moved away, leaving him alone in a house that was too large for him to maintain. After a brief pause, he unexpectedly offered to sell it to me. I didn't hesitate for a second. The price was more than fair, and I had the funds. To ensure no one could dispute the purchase in the future, I asked him to make it a gift deed. The house came fully furnished with antique furniture, clocks, and lamps. The second floor housed a bedroom and an office, both accessible from a spacious living room. The first floor featured a kitchen, bathroom, and an enormous hall. And of course, there was the dry, cool basement. I had long dreamed of opening my own antique shop, and buying this house in the city's historic district was the perfect opportunity. The notary collected his fee and left, and just then my cell phone rang. "Where are you?" My wife, Victoria, always started conversations with this ridiculous question, as if my whereabouts were of the utmost importance to her. "I'm grabbing lunch. Did you need something?" I tried to keep my voice gentle. "I'm going to be late tonight. It's Tammy's birthday and the girls and I are celebrating," she said, speaking rapidly as usual. "Want me to pick you up?" I asked, more out of habit than anything else. "No need. Just keep an eye on Tyler and help him with his math homework. He has a test coming up." She hung up after blowing a kiss through the phone. Lucky me with Victoria, the picture-perfect wife and homemaker who always kept everything under control. When I got home, my son had already eaten dinner and was glued to the computer screen. "How's the homework coming along?" "It's done," he mumbled, eyes never leaving the screen. Recently, my attempts to connect with him had been met with resistance, and interestingly enough, his reluctance to communicate with me seemed to have Victoria's full support. At times, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was deliberately turning my son against me. But it wasn't long before I discovered the reason behind my son's behavior, and I stopped trying to get closer to him. 6 months ago, my family life with Victoria, my wife of 16 years, had seemed picture-perfect. We had married young. I was 22, and she was 20. The decision to tie the knot had been entirely hers. After 6 months of lukewarm interactions, Victoria seemed to have undergone a complete transformation. She called constantly, practically forcing her company on me, befriended my mother, and became a regular visitor at our home. It reached a point where my mother began insistently advising me not to resist and to quickly propose to such a wonderful girl. She even visited Victoria's parents, which only strengthened her resolve to see us married. In the end, they wore me down, convincing me that I shouldn't let a good thing pass me by, and I proposed to Victoria. Unsurprisingly, she immediately accepted, and 3 months later we were husband and wife. My father never quite warmed up to Victoria, but he chose to remain silent and not interfere in the women's matrimonial scheming, watching from the sidelines as his own son was ensnared. As it turned out, Victoria was already 2 months pregnant when we got married. As a decent man, I felt obligated to marry her, and 7 months later Tyler was born. With the help of my parents, we purchased a 2-bedroom apartment, so housing was never an issue. For the first 5 years, everything seemed wonderful. I worked as an art historian, and after 8 years at a museum, I was unexpectedly hired by a large antique firm. My job involved appraising pieces, consulting collectors, and gaining practical experience in the field. Over time, I built a circle of regular clients who respected my expertise. Victoria worked at a real estate agency. As Tyler grew older, I couldn't help but notice that he looked less and less like me. I never brought it up, fearing I might inadvertently offend my wife, but I did mention it to my mother. She dismissed my concerns, saying that children don't always resemble their fathers, and that it didn't mean Tyler wasn't mine. "Michael, don't mess with my head, and don't you dare upset Victoria. Who else could he possibly look like, the neighbor?" she chided. After my father passed away, my mother transferred her apartment to Tyler, bypassing me entirely. When I asked why she had left the apartment to him instead of me, she stated, "What difference does it make? After all, Tyler is my grandson." She let slip that it had been Victoria's idea and that she had even brought the notary. That was the first time I felt something was off. 2 years later, my mother died and the apartment was rented out, with the income going straight into Victoria's pocket, as she liked to remind me. Everything in my family seemed fine until the moment I dialed Victoria's number and accidentally intercepted her conversation with some unknown man. At first I wanted to disconnect, but then the conversation piqued my interest, and I inadvertently hit the record button on my phone. My beloved wife Victoria was complaining to the stranger that she couldn't take it anymore, that she was ready to leave this disgusting idiot at any moment, referring, I realized, to me. Then she asked if her conversation partner missed their son and whether it was time to tell him everything. The man on the other end chuckled and said they needed to wait just a little longer. The call ended there. Have you ever been stung by wasps? Not just anywhere, but in the head? It felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my skull. At that moment, I felt like an entire swarm of angry bees had attacked my head. A jackhammer pounded in my temples, my limbs went numb, and I struggled to breathe. My first instinct was to tear out the man's throat and give Victoria a piece of my mind, to tell her everything. But I gradually cooled down, realizing that it would achieve nothing and only cause more problems. I remember wandering the damp autumn streets for hours, listening to the recording over and over again until I had it memorized. My heart ached, and I wanted to tilt my head back and howl into the emptiness of the autumn sky. Eventually, I locked myself in my office, gathered every ounce of willpower to quell my emotions, and began to prepare for my departure. From the conversation, it was clear that Tyler wasn't my son. I made arrangements with a forensic lab and secretly brought in samples for analysis. 3 days later, I had my answer. Tyler was not my biological child. Oh, Victoria, my sweet, innocent wife. Now I understood what had prompted the rush to marry. She had gotten pregnant by someone else and needed to legitimize the pregnancy at any cost. So she found herself a fool me seduced me and quickly tricked me into marrying her. My father had probably suspected something on a subconscious level, which explained his initial dislike of my bride-to-be. Apparently, the real father hadn't been eager to become a dad at the time, but time has a way of changing things. Victoria must have reconnected with him. Old flames reignited, and they shared a son. I, the fool, had served my purpose. It was time to kick me to the curb and create a happy little family with her true love. My parents' apartment was already in Tyler's name, And in the event of a divorce, our apartment would remain with her, knowing the gender-biased, feminist-leaning courts. The car and everything else would also be hers. I would be left with scraps if I was lucky. I was nothing more than a patsy, while she was sitting pretty with Tyler's beloved father. And there I was, facing the prospect of sleeping under a bridge. Honestly, at first I had no idea how to handle the situation. I had some money from my job, but like most husbands, I paid for the privilege of access to my wife's body, handing over nearly my entire salary. I was a strange mix of an ATM and a vibrator, so my future prospects were looking bleak. After learning the truth about my son, I decided to find out who Victoria's lover was and began unraveling the mystery. And that's when I was hit with another surprise. Her longtime lover and Tyler's father was none other than my boss. I had simply tracked Victoria when she claimed to be visiting a girlfriend and discovered that she was actually meeting with dear Archibald Thompson, the director of the antique firm where I worked. So it turned out I hadn't gotten the job based on my merits. Apparently the plan from the very beginning was to set me up at work so I could provide for their son, and then they could kick me to the curb. A well-executed, multi-step plan spanning 16 years. Archibald was married, and the firm and all the money belonged to his wife. Understandably, if he had spoken of divorce back then, he would have been left with nothing. But now, a year after his wife's death, there were just some formalities to settle regarding the inheritance, and he could finally reunite with his beloved Victoria and their son. And Victoria hadn't been idle all this time. She had managed to take possession of my parents' apartment, apparently as compensation for the years she had spent with me. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Well, forewarned is forearmed. I didn't let on that I knew everything, holding myself together with all my might, trying to please and agree with Victoria at every turn to lull her into a false sense of security. I began catering to my boss's every whim as if trying to prove my loyalty. They probably had a good laugh at my expense during their secret meetings, eagerly anticipating the moment they could give me the boot. And then an event occurred that radically altered the course of my life and inspired my subsequent actions. My father had worked his entire life as an accountant at a logging company, and he had only two unwavering passions: numismatics and ancient Japanese poetry. My mother, like most wives, had initially tried to fight what she called his nonsense, but eventually she threw up her hands and left him to his hobbies. In the evenings, Dad would sit at his desk, meticulously sorting through his coin collection. When he passed away, the collection vanished. No one paid much attention to it. My mother was indifferent, and I was preoccupied with improving my family's well-being. The collection faded from memory. One evening, out of the blue, my aunt, my father's sister, called me. We chatted briefly about trivial matters. I was in a depressed state and not particularly talkative. Unexpectedly, Aunt Olivia mentioned that shortly before his death, Dad had entrusted her with a suitcase, requesting that she pass it on to me. But life got in the way, and she completely forgot about it. Just that day, she had been rummaging through her attic and stumbled upon the suitcase in a pile of junk. It was locked, and she had no idea what was inside. She told me I could pick it up whenever I wanted. To be honest, I didn't think much of the conversation and half-heartedly promised to swing by and collect the mysterious suitcase I had suddenly inherited. 5 days later, I found myself in my aunt's neighborhood and retrieved Dad's suitcase. I took it to work and tried to open it, but to no avail. The suitcase was crafted from thin titanium sheets and covered in leather. Without the key, the only way to open it would be with an oxyacetylene torch, but that risked damaging the contents, especially since I had no clue what was inside. I can't explain why, but I developed an obsessive need to discover what Dad had stored in this suitcase. But where could I find the key? And then it hit me. If Dad had left me the suitcase, he must have known I wouldn't be able to open it without the key. He must have been confident that I would find it. I called Aunt Olivia and asked if Dad had left me anything else. She thought for a moment before remembering that she had one of his notebooks bound in leather. I immediately went to her and she handed me the old notebook. I didn't find anything particularly interesting in the notebook except for the numbers on the cover, which denoted my birth year, and the letter preceding them, which was the first initial of my name. It felt like a code for a bank safe deposit box. Trying to think logically, I reasoned that in his final years, my father, limited by an old injury, must have chosen a bank close to home. Dad was meticulous and wouldn't have trusted a fly-by-night commercial bank. It was most likely a state-run bank, less susceptible to the whims of the market economy. I figured it had to be near our old apartment. Within an hour, I was walking through the doors of the local branch of the state bank. A charming young woman in a black skirt, white blouse, and green scarf greeted me. I explained my situation, and she asked me to wait with a sweet smile before disappearing behind a door that led into the depths of this money temple. They brought me coffee, and I was surprised by the extraordinary service. Half an hour later, a distinguished-looking man emerged and asked me to follow him. I found myself in a spacious office with the bank's head of security and the senior teller. They asked me to name a pet, and then inquired about my father's initials. After a while, they brought a long, narrow box into the office, opened it, and left me alone with its contents. Inside, I found a bundle containing a white metal ring with my father's initials, a small key, and a figurine of a samurai wielding 2 Japanese swords. I instinctively tried on the ring, and it fit perfectly on my right ring finger. The office owner returned. I signed the documents to close the safe deposit box, and they escorted me to the exit. Back at work, I inserted the key into the lock below the suitcase's handle. The lock clicked open, revealing the contents. As expected, it was filled with coins. When I spread them out on the table, having locked the door, I broke out in a cold sweat. There were rare American, Soviet, and foreign coins, a few Spanish macuquinas from the Conquest era, a complete set of U.S. coins from 1958, Confederate States of America silver dollars from the Civil War era, and finally, an extremely rare American gold coin from the early 1800s. All the coins had certificates of authenticity and documents confirming legal ownership. It was a real treasure trove. Being no stranger to the antique business, I was simply stunned. At a glance, I knew this was worth serious money and not in dollars. Honestly, it felt like a dream. I carefully packed the coins back into the suitcase and began to contemplate how to use this unexpected windfall to resolve my complicated life situation. I could simply divorce, but those scoundrels had stolen 16 years of my life. They robbed me of my unborn son, deprived me of the joy of fatherhood, the joy of holding my own child, my heir. They essentially stripped me of a man's primary purpose to leave a legacy behind. And after all that, I was just supposed to walk away? First, I bought myself a car. I thought a Porsche Cayenne would be most suitable. I rented a parking space for it 2 blocks from our family nest. You already know about the house I purchased in the city's historic district. The very next day, I hired designers and a construction crew. A month and a half later, a new antique firm and shop appeared in the city. Needless to say, all my clientele started doing business with the new firm. Meanwhile, things went from bad to worse for Archibald's company: constant inspections, loss of clients to competitors, and other misfortunes unexpectedly befell the poor head of the firm. Employees began to jump ship. And finally, even the general director's secretary quit. It was painful to watch Archibald. He had lost his former luster and was but a shadow of the once successful antique businessman. In the end, I was the only employee left at the firm. Victoria, too, had changed. Her evening absences became less frequent and shorter. She showed unprecedented care and tenderness towards me. I, however, continued to feign ignorance and passionately played the role of the cuckolded fool. Finally, through intermediaries, I bought myself a mansion outside the city, built on the site of a ranger's lodge surrounded by a magnificent pine forest, and realized my childhood dream of owning a purebred German shepherd. All this splendor was registered in my aunt's name, who immediately made a gift deed to me. With that, the question of my new residence was settled. It was time to stop playing the fool and move to the final phase of the operation. The moment came when Archibald's firm was denied rental space due to delayed rent payments. The new antique firm had paid a large sum for the lease, and Mr. Director was given 3 days to vacate the premises. On the last day I called Victoria and asked her to come to the office. She was surprised but complied with my request. We entered Archibald's office, and Victoria sensed something was amiss but continued to play the role of the oblivious fool. We sat at the table, and I silently laid out a pile of photos illustrating my wife's amorous adventures with my boss. Trust me, there was plenty to look at. You should have seen their faces. I even feared that Archibald would have a stroke. Victoria sat stone-faced, tears streaming down her cheeks. I almost felt sorry for her, but to avoid succumbing to pity, I turned on the recorder, filling the office with the dialogue of the two lovers discussing the prospects of the cuckolded fool who had served his purpose. Not wanting to disturb their enjoyment of the recording, I stood up and headed for the door without looking back. "Michael," Victoria's voice was a storm of emotions. Anger, disappointment, and finally, fear. "Wait, you've got it all wrong." I didn't turn around. "Cleach GC. All that's left is to hear, 'It's not what you think. Go to the car.'" I couldn't resist glancing up from the second-floor window. A distraught Victoria and a pale former boss looked back at me. I politely bowed, waved my hand, disarmed the alarm, climbed into the driver's seat, and as I started the engine, the samurai hanging from the chain seemed to cheekily swing his swords and wink at me. I pulled away, and within moments I merged into the stream of cars, always rushing somewhere. That's the story. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell to not miss new stories. Pretty amazing story, huh? If you liked it, hit that subscribe button to stay updated.